Duncan Brock is a member of the leadership team of the Chartered Institute of Purchasing and Supply. Duncan works with corporate and public sector customers globally with products and services that help them develop and improve their procurement and supply team's capability. Duncan regularly chairs and presents at procurement and supply conferences and forums. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Duncan Brock.
So, good afternoon. I know it's after lunch, and it's always a bit of a challenge, isn't it, to have this slot. But as I was reflecting on why am I here? What's an Englishman doing in South Africa at the moment? Obviously, I came for the weather, because I'm an Englishman. And it's winter here, but it's still warmer than in England. I spoke to my wife yesterday. We'd had 1 month's rain in a day in the UK. So it's great to be here for the weather. I could be watching cricket. I could be watching England win the World Cup. South Africa, probably not such a good chance. But the real reason I'm here is to escape Brexit. I've spent the last 3 years observing what's going on with Brexit and the challenges that come with Brexit. And it's a delight to come to another country, turn on the television, and not see a single story about Brexit. You have your own challenges politically, I get that, but we've been living with a Brexit challenge now for the last 3 years, and there are lessons to be learned. There's lessons to be learned about what's gone on, but particularly from a procurement and supply perspective, there's been some real lessons about what to do when these sort of geopolitical situations happen. So when I'm going to talk about Brexit, what I'm hoping to do is to bring it to life for you, that you can actually understand what you may have to be doing in your own environments when these sort of political shocks happen and how you effectively try and mitigate those as you go through. I just want to touch on SIPS first, if I may. So we are the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply. And I've also been sat for the last 2 days looking at logos. And if you put South Africa together with SIPS, it's very close to SAPIX. Just think on that for a minute, okay? But we are the Chartered Institute, and we are really set up as the professional body for procurement. So while SAPIX and APIX and ASCM cover the supply chain and supply chain management, we focus specifically in the area of procurement. And around that, we are a professional institute. We're set up to be the professional body, and we represent the profession on procurement here in South Africa, in Ghana, in Dubai, in the UK, as being the professional body that people would turn to for advice, guidance, insights around procurement. We are a membership organisation, as most professional institutes are. We've got about 70,000 members worldwide. 18,000 of those come from the Africa continent. So a really strong presence here, as well as in the UK and elsewhere in the world. And we try to build up this global network. I think in supply chain, in procurement, they are global professions now. And it's very important that we try and share good practice, best practice, wherever it may be in the world, and get people to learn from each other. There is no area in the world you go to where you say, that's perfect, that's really set up in the right way. But we are developing as a profession, and it's really important that we share and we network and we link those things around. We as SIPS set some standards. We set standards for individuals to be certified in procurement, but also for organizations to be assessed and certified. And that's a core part of what we do to try and drive professionalization and to drive people up the standards they need to get to. And overall, we also then spent a lot of time now working more with organizations to build up their own skills, capabilities, as they go through on that basis. We do have offices around the world, as you can see from the slide. So I'm based in the UK, the head office. Also in Europe, we've got the offices in Turkey. I'm not sure Turkey's in Europe, but we call it Europe. We're actually on the Asia side of Turkey, so probably not, but it's close enough. We've also got the offices here in South Africa, near Pretoria, and as I said, in Ghana, in Accra, which we opened up recently. We've got a base in the Middle East covering the Dubai. We've got Singapore and Australia. And then the most recent one for us is opening up in the US. We call ourselves a global institute. It was always a challenge for us to not have that strong presence in the US. A lot of decision-making in supply chain and in procurement particularly takes place in US headquarters. So it's quite important for us to try and establish a strong presence now in the US. And actually, as part of collaboration, we're doing that alongside ASCM, or as was APIX. So we're actually sharing an office with them in Chicago, which I think is a good signal of collaboration between two sort of organizations that are very similar in style, but cover very different parts of the supply chain. And if you do know anything about SIPs, we also are constantly looking to keep fresh with the profession, keep updated. One of the key things is our qualification programs. If you want to get certified in procurement, you need to study. And the content of that program gets updated every 3 or 4 years. It's a major undertaking for us, but trying to keep it as international as possible, but also to reflect the changes going on in the profession. I'm going to come to those as we go forward. But the challenges around ethics, the challenges around transparency and visibility down the supply chain, the applications of technologies, those things weren't there 10 years ago when you studied to do your SIPs. But now they're clearly a key part of what needs to happen for the profession. And it's really important that we keep that education program fresh and alive and refreshed as it goes through. So we're launching those new qualifications this year as we speak. One of the new things that's come through is this focus on, I suppose, the corporate social responsibility down your supply chains. And coming from the UK, we have a Modern Slavery Act. Now, that act was brought in about 3 years ago now. And it basically says that any organization that has a turnover of, I'll use pounds, 36 million pounds or more, has to make a statement in its annual accounts about modern slavery. You've got to say what you're doing to try and eradicate modern slavery in your supply chain. And that's quite an important thing, because if you're going to put it in your public accounts, 1 year you can say, well, I've looked at my supply chain and I think it's all right. And then next year, well, I put some clauses in my contracts to make sure my suppliers don't have it. But what are you really doing to understand the risks of things like modern slavery, child labour, down through your supply chains? And it's not just the UK. Australia brought an act in only this year, asking the same sort of challenges and issues. The same in France, the same in California. These things are coming through the supply chain, and we're going to try and help people, educate them about what to do, but also look at how they eliminate the risks associated with things like modern slavery. We also run graduation ceremonies, which are great fun. It's really good to be able to see people celebrate when they have actually achieved their qualifications. I have the pleasure of hosting ours in the UK. 250 people coming up on the stage, all receiving their certificate with their gowns on. It's great. It's great to see people celebrate the fact they've got a real vocational qualification. And we've got ours in South Africa in August, where again, we've got people coming along to celebrate success of going through. So a great way in which we can showcase that people are really dedicated to this profession and take it in the right way. The other thing that we're trying to do more of now is really focus on the difference that procurement can make. And I sat through the ASCM presentation this morning, and any of you who are there, they were talking about making an impact on supply chain. And I really do see that good supply chain, good procurement can make a significant difference to people's lives. We've got the pleasure of being awarded a grant by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to focus on procurement in healthcare here in South Africa and in Nigeria and in Kenya. Really looking at how we start to build up sustainable procurement practices in healthcare. Because I've heard quite a few presentations over the last 2 days talking about the last mile delivery and getting from warehouse through to point of use. But that's okay if the procurement works well. And clearly the procurement isn't working very well. So how do you go about improving the procurement, both in the centre and in the states, the provinces and the counties across these various countries? That way we can really make a difference by getting affordable drugs that then flow through the supply chain to get to point of use. So a focus there on helping people's lives. We have a SIPS Foundation, where again we support people to be educated in procurement. A lot of people across Africa, where affordability is a challenge, where we can actually help them to fund themselves to improve what they do in their education. And something that's been close to my heart recently is a focus on procurement in construction. We had a disaster in the UK 2 years ago now, 2 years in June. It was Grenfell Tower. Now, if you weren't in the UK, you may not have even seen it. But in the UK, we had 72 people die in a tower block in the centre of London. because a fire spread, went up the outside of the building, and people couldn't get out. Now, that's a sort of disaster that shouldn't happen. And when you start to unpick what went wrong, it was a lot to do with competence. People not understanding what they needed to do properly to make sure that things were sourced effectively, to the right specification, to the right quality, installed in the right way, and then the building managed effectively. So I've been part of a working group looking at competence across construction, and I've been disappointed, I suppose is a good description, of how poor procurement and supply chain management is in that sector. It seems to be a sector that looks after itself, run by architects, engineers, quantity surveyors, people who believe they know best, but won't turn for experience and expertise when they need to do. And it's certainly, in the UK, we're trying to not waste the opportunity to drive a change associated with risk in construction and trying to get good practices built in early as we go through. So there's some examples of where I believe procurement can really make a significant difference and make an impact to people's lives. But let me come on to the core part of here, which is Brexit, and the challenges associated with that. I'm going to talk about procurement, but procurement in a supply chain context. But before I touch on Brexit, there are a few other areas I think that in procurement particularly that are challenges for us at the moment. And one is technology. There have been presentations at this conference about blockchain and about the implementation of data analytics and AI. And I keep hearing people talking about what they're going to do. I think we're still very, very slow in procurement and supply in really implementing the benefits that technologies bring. People are still doing pilots, thinking about it, touching on it. Technology should give speed. It should give process efficiency. It should give transparency and visibility, if this done well. But we still seem to be very stuck in the traditional ways of doing procurement, the transactional activities, firefighting, being very busy, but not necessarily getting on with implementing the real benefits that technologies can bring. They're coming, and they will take over. And we actually released a paper about a year ago now, talking about the impact of technology in supply chain. And if you ever want to have a look at it, it's on our website. It's called The Future of Procurement and Supply. But it talks about the supply chain and what could happen if technologies really take hold. And let me just give you one example. Anyone dealt with Amazon Business here? Amazon Business? I mean, if you're in the US, if you're across Europe, they are everywhere. Basically saying to any people in the procurement and supply chain, don't worry about it, give it to us, because we're Amazon. And we can manage everything for you. We can manage your logistics, your supply chain, a great website that people can order on. You know, just leave it with us. Sounds like an ideal scenario. But what happens when you put all your spend with Amazon? What happens when suddenly they have all your data, all your information? They're in control of your supply chain. Is that really where you want to get to? That's certainly the proposition they're putting forward to a number of big organizations now. But I think we really have to grasp the opportunity that technology brings and how we take it through. And I said a link to that is transparency. The challenge of having transparency and visibility of decision-making, and obviously fraud, corruption comes from poor decision-making, poor visibility that goes on around that, but also transparency of your supply chain. Do you really understand what goes on down your supply chain? Not just the tier one, not just to those suppliers that you know, but do you understand what goes on through tier 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6? That's where the problems are, and that's where the problems will hit you when something goes wrong. And in today's environment of social media, where people challenge decision-making, challenge the companies, any problem that happens in your supply chain goes right back up to the top. It goes back to the big brands, the big companies, because you're accountable for what went on in your supply chain. And most people I speak to don't have that transparency and visibility of their supply chain. They don't really understand it. If you're here dealing with a distributor, do you understand where they're getting their stuff from? Have you really understood that supply chain effectively? The risks, the issues, the challenges? Probably not. And yet, if you talk to anyone at a CEO level, COO level, their big challenge is risk and managing risk, and they want you to understand your supply chains and to advise them and guide them about what's gone wrong. And at the moment, we can't necessarily answer those questions in the way that we should. And both of those things, both the technologies and transparencies, is about skills. It is about being a modern procurement or supply chain professional and keeping yourself up to date with the changes, the challenges, the issues, and keep refreshing those skills. Now, I am a SIPS qualified person, and I do meet some SIPS qualified people around the world who qualified 15 years ago and are still saying, I'm qualified. And I go, really? Do you really think you're still up to date with what's going on in procurement? I started my life in procurement 35 years ago. If I was doing then what I'm doing now, I wouldn't have a job. You know, you've got to keep those skills refreshed and up to date. And that's something I don't think we do enough of, investing in the skills that we need. But let me come to Brexit. I want to talk about some of the challenges that Brexit brought and then try and bring it to life for you in terms of what you can maybe think about and do differently within your own supply chains. And I'm going to touch on some of these areas here about the tariffs and customs, and I'll talk about the people and the risks, but particularly the uncertainty. The one thing that Brexit is doing to us at the moment is it's causing huge amount of uncertainty because no one quite knows what the answer is. And I keep getting asked, what's your view, Duncan, about what's going to happen in Brexit? I was like, I don't know. The politicians can't sort it out. How am I going to tell you? But the challenge is about uncertainty. We are having to make decisions about the future of our supply chains, sourcing, procurement, whatever you want to do, without knowing what the future relationship will be between us and Europe. And that is a major issue for us. If you're deciding to source parts for a new engine or for a new car or for new drugs or pharmaceuticals, how can you make a decision about where to source from if you don't know what the trading relationship will be between you and the countries you might want to source from? It's chaos. The presentation yesterday morning wasn't about edge of chaos, and all I could see was Brexit, because we really have gone to the precipice a few times on this, so what's going to happen? And stepped towards it. 29th of March was the first one, stepped away from it. Next one's coming is the 31st of October. We're going to step towards it again. What's going to happen? But every time we hit that issue, it causes huge shockwaves down through the supply chain. And I'll touch on a few of those in a minute. The other thing about Brexit is the negotiation, right? This has been a fascinating case study on how not to negotiate if you're British, okay? If you think about a team negotiation, anyone been in a team negotiation? Yeah? You sat around a table with 3 or 4 other people trying to deal with the third party. They are difficult. You need to prepare properly. You need to go in with consistent approach. You need to make sure your boss, probably your CEO, who swans into the room, doesn't go off-piste and just try and do a deal, because that's what CEOs do. You've got to be planned, organised, consistent. And the credit to the Europeans, they have been brilliant. Hats off to them. 27 countries all coming together, agreeing a negotiation position, giving absolute authority to their lead negotiator, Michel Barnier, to go into the room with the British and negotiate. And they have stuck to that consistently all the way through. We, as Brits, have thought, we know how to do this. We'll go and talk to the German Prime Minister. We'll go and talk to the French President. We'll talk to the Dutch Prime Minister, the Italians. We'll talk to anybody to try and get round this negotiation. And that's what salespeople do, isn't it? They try and get round procurement and supply people and go to the decision makers. But every time we've done that, they pushed us right back to the negotiation table where they're all organised behind Michel Barnier as the lead negotiator. Absolute picture of good decision-making. They know what their governance is, they know how to make decisions, how to pass them back, and so on. Fascinating. We, as the British, have had 3 Brexit secretaries so far. Probably a 4th one by the time we have some elections that will finish in the Tory leadership by July. We've had 3 so far, probably a 4th. One of them only lasted 4 months. We have had 1 Prime Minister. She's been consistent. Oh no, she's gone now. We have had 2 trade secretaries, 2 industry secretaries, 2 foreign secretaries, all briefing separately as to what they think should happen. So as you can imagine, a unified European position against a chaos, which has been the British position. And if you ever think about going into a negotiation of that nature, that scale, and not being organised, that's probably where you'll fail. So if any of you are thinking about going into those negotiations in that sort of way, you've got to prepare. Be clear about who's got the job. Be clear about your communication. And make sure you have solutions. We would go to Europe at times saying, well, we don't know what to do. What do you think? Right? This Irish backstop thing, which everyone talks about but no one quite understands. What do you think the answer is, Europe? And then we're going, well, it's up to you. You chose to leave. You come back to us with your solutions. And we weren't able to do it. So it's all about having that give and take on a negotiation, which I think is a really interesting element of it. And talk about communication. Use phrases that mean something, okay? Brexit means Brexit. Have you ever heard that one? The Prime Minister, Theresa May, kept on saying that. And he said, yeah, but what's Brexit? Oh, it means Brexit. And that phrase was being repeated time and again without anyone really understanding what it was. The other phrase that she used all the time, which really used to annoy me, is, let me be clear. And then she'd carry on using the same phrases that she was using before, just spin around at different times. She had a real tough time with the Europeans. She just wasn't able to really position things in a way that made it clear. And people understood and had empathized with her, which is probably why she's left, or she's leaving, as she goes through. But team negotiations, I think we can all learn from that. We can learn about how you'd go about negotiating effectively on a team basis. What are the lessons to learn? Currency. Well, see, I was sat here yesterday morning looking at the way your currency in South Africa fluctuates, thinking we've got away lightly in the pounds, but we've never had the level of fluctuation that we've currently got with the pound against the euro and the dollar. And it has opened people's eyes to the issues associated with currency fluctuations. We've never really had to cope with that over the last 30 years. It's been pretty stable. It's moved up and down a bit. But then suddenly we had a vote in June 2016, and the pound dropped by 10%. Now, I know in South Africa, it's only 10%, you say? But actually, for us, it was a big shock. And what it meant is that people were then pulling out their contracts and going, do I have a currency clause in here? Oh, no, I don't. Well, I need to do one. My suppliers are asking me for an increase because of currency exposure. Well, how exposed are they to these various currencies? It's a real challenge. And it's really challenged people to understand their exposure to the various currencies, again, down through the tiers of the supply chain. Because I might deal with a distributor, and I'm paying them in pounds, but they're sourcing out of Europe, or they're sourcing out to America, and they're exposed in different ways to the different currencies. And then you start to look at hedging and options and ways of mitigating and offsetting the risks in currency. It is not easy. Anyone who's been exposed to currencies in the way that I'm sure you have and we have, trying to work your way through what the right answer is to offset currencies is a big challenge. And then what you say is, well, I'll go and talk to my finance people because they'll know. And they don't know either. Because they're not quite sure what they're selling in various currencies and what they're receiving in other currencies. Have they ever done that natural hedging to work it out in the right way? There's some real lessons about exposure to currency, but then working out what you would do to offset those issues and those risks as they go through. So currency is a challenge. Tariffs. We, again, I'll use the UK, have never had to deal with tariffs in Europe for the last 30 years, 40 years. And suddenly, coming up to the 29th of March, we could have dropped into WTO rules, World Trade Organization rules. And that could have suddenly had a huge impact on the costs of goods and services exporting and importing overnight, which would have led to a huge inflationary spike, which would probably pass its way through the supply chain in a couple of years by the time it's come in and gone through and gone out the other side. And you think, well, okay, we'd have gone to WTO rules, at least we'd understood it, and then we'd have worked our way through it. But again, do any people's contracts cover clauses associated with tariffs? Probably not. And then you look at what Donald Trump is doing. He's using tariffs now as a weapon, isn't he? He's doing what he feels like to try and force people to come to comply with his trade, in his head, his version of trade, by having trade wars. And those tariffs go into steel. They go into different parts. They drop into China. China puts them back on the US. How exposed are you to any of those tariffs? They start to feed their way through, don't they? And clearly, he is now starting to use this as his method of choice to try and force some changes in trade. So I don't think it's going to be a one-off. Because if he doesn't get his way, he doubles the tariff. And then if he doesn't get his way again, is he going to double it again? And those tariffs will feed their way through the supply chain. It's a big risk, not necessarily from security of supply, but financial planning, to understand whether or not you are exposed to the potential tariffs that come through, and whether you have in place the plans to offset them, or can you pass them through your supply chain onto your customers? Now, is that acceptable? Well, it depends on who else is in the supply chain. But certainly there are real issues associated with what you do with that. But I don't see this changing. I see the tariff situation now, because of the way that Trump particularly is using it and the reaction he's getting from the global trading partners, as being a real instability that's going to continue to reflect on our pricing and our inflation and our challenges associated with that. And then we've got customs. Now, again, I've sat there through a few presentations over the last couple of days, and clearly within Africa, custom delays are normal. But we're not used to them, okay? We haven't had these sort of challenges and delays. And we have lean supply chains which rely on effective flow of materials through the ports. You know, England or UK is an island. So somehow it has to get from Europe, somehow, or from the US or whatever, into the UK. And we have had pretty seamless flow of materials. I worked for Black & Decker for 10 years. I worked for Ford. We were championing lean supply chain, just in time, vendor managed inventory, the sort of things that people still dream about. But we were so used to having it, got rid of our warehouses, turned it all into manufacturing space. I went to one of the automotive factories recently. Not only have they got rid of all the warehouses and replaced them with factories, all the car parks have gone. So you have to go and park 2 miles away to be able to get ferried into the factory, turning things into productive space. And so what's happening now? Well, now people are unsure. We as SIPS have done some studies. Every 6 months now, we've done a survey on people's views of delays of customs. And it's quite concerning that actually businesses will go out of business, they'll go bankrupt because of delays of customs. Because what happens, I'm exporting into Europe. My contract says if you're late by 2 hours, that's all, then you'll have a penalty. And if I don't receive it within 12 hours, then I won't pay you at all. So you think of an exporter having that sort of exposure to what should have been quite a lean supply chain. And we sort of stat that said 11% of businesses will go bankrupt if these delays happen because of the penalties that will be imposed by the customers. So that's one issue. The second issue is we don't have any space to store all the trucks that will be queued up waiting to go through the ports. There was the French decided, French like strikes. I mean, anyone who's dealt with the French, they love their strikes. So they decided in March to go and test whether or not this would happen. And so the security people, the customs people, decided to check every truck at Calais, which goes on the port to Dover. And in 12 hours, there was a queue of 26 kilometers long of trucks waiting to get through the port. That's in 12 hours. So you just imagine that impact on the supply chains, because we don't have any spaces. There's a thing called Operation Stack, which is in the UK, which means we'll turn the motorways to go down to the port into places where all the lorries can park. And then there was a great one. I was at our UK conference in the UK, and I was listening to our economist talk. And I was, probably after lunch, dozing a bit. And then he suddenly said, and there's this thing called Operation Brock. Right? My surname is Brock. It's like, Operation Brock? Never heard of that. Let's Google. It's a Brexit response across Kent, apparently, which basically means take over some old airfields and park all the lorries on the airfield and then gradually put them through the ports when you can do. Fascinating. But there are these plans to offset customs delays. But we could avoid all those by the use of technology. You look at frictionless borders, and technology will solve those. You have your truck, you've got your customs paperwork all there, it passes through, number recognition, quick check, off it goes. It happens across the world. But we haven't invested in that, nor have the French or the Germans or particularly the Irish. So we have borders where we have no technology, and yet technology could solve the customs delays. But while we're still debating whether or not we will have a deal with Europe, or whether or not that deal will look like, no one's investing in technology, so the customs is going to be chaos. And it's the biggest fear, I think, that everyone has, is that we will have those sort of delays. Now, I know you'll be sat there with an African context going, you don't know what it's like, okay? The borders here, the challenges, the issues associated with facilitating payments to get you through the borders, I get that. But I think the lessons are about how do you overcome those challenges? How do you end up with that lean, flexible supply chain so that you don't get the challenges associated with that? And it is a big one. And it's the nightmare scenario that everyone talks about, but no one has yet come up with a solution. And I do come back to it. There are solutions out there. Someone's just got to start investing in them. They may not be implemented for 3 or 4 years, but when we're transitioning, we could actually get a good custom solution in place. And then we've got an issue with people. So being a part of Europe, we've had free flow of people, skills, and people have come to the UK to work. UK people have gone to Europe, freely available to work in different places. And we're now starting to see shortages of key skills in the UK. Now, we have the pleasure of having very low unemployment. Okay? Was you 39% officially in South Africa at the moment? We're at about 5%. That's brilliant. But that means there is a shortage of key skills. And when you've got Europeans deciding that they don't quite know what the situation is going to be like for their residency in the future, they're starting to go home. And we are losing key skills in key sectors, particularly in the medical sector, particularly in the construction sector. There are key skills now who are going to look for work elsewhere in Europe rather than stay in the UK. And we also have quite seasonal workforces of people coming into our fields to pick crops. They're not coming into the UK at the moment. We have got crops being wasted in fields because there's no one to pick them. Because the wages that we pay, most of the UK people aren't prepared to work for that wage. And so we've got farmers basically with fields full of strawberries and fields full of crops not being picked because we can't get the people to pick them. Because of Brexit. No, because of the vote to do Brexit and because no one's quite sure what the answer is. And whether or not there'll be guaranteed free movement of labour as we go through. Big challenge. And I think that freedom of movement is not just a political statement. People vote with their feelings, don't they? Am I prepared to stay here on the risk that I might be booted out in 2 years? Or do I go and find some work elsewhere, particularly if I've got that flexibility and the language skills? So a key issue for us is around that flexibility in the workforce. And then the other piece is around, so what do people do? And if you ask any organisation, what are they doing currently? Most of them say, I've done my risk assessment, which is a start. At least they've gone and they've done an assessment of the potential issues associated with this geopolitical crisis, which is Brexit, and the impact that it may have on their business. But in most cases, what they've done is they've done the risk assessment, reported it to the board, put it in the bottom drawer and hope it never happens. And I don't know, have you all done your risk assessments? I'm sure you do them all the time. You do your likelihood and your impact and you grade it from red to green. And if it's red, you get worried. And if it's green, you leave it alone, it's okay. But most cases, we don't follow that through. We've reported to the board, we're happy, they've said thank you, and then we've gone on with our day job. So what are you going to do to mitigate those risks? How are you going to manage the ongoing situation? That's where we are being asked to do as a profession, is to step up and take ownership for that. Not pass it back onto the board, or give it to legal, or pass it on to the operations team. It should be our job to manage and mitigate those risks. So what's happening at the moment in the UK? One of the mitigating risks is let's build stocks up. Okay, so I talk about lean supply chain. We have had a boon in manufacturing because everyone is building up stocks. you saw the spike of the economy to the end of March was incredible because people were putting stuff in warehouses just in case. We ran out of warehouse space. The cost of warehouses went through the roof, particularly chilled, anything to do with chilled food storage. Prices went astronomical because there was no capacity around it. And now what happened in April and May is we stepped away from the cliff edge, and now that stock's being used up. We had the lowest ever manufacturing number in the UK for 10 years maybe on automotive. Because they built all the cars, just in case, and now they had to sell all the cars. And so they closed the factories. So that's sort of, how am I going to offset a risk? I'll build my stocks up. Has been it's a real problem to the economy. And I could just see another spike happening in September and October because everyone will do it again. We'll be right up against the deadline and people will build up stocks yet again, just in case. So it's not necessarily the right way, but I could see why people were doing it. The things that used to make me smile was the news story. Journalists would go around asking about Brexit. And I give a few talks about it as well. And they say to this woman, are you stocking up for Brexit? And she'll open the cupboards in her kitchen. And she'll have all the tins of beans and tins of peas and tins of pasta. It's like, why? Oh, well, just in case the shops run out. That's the sort of level of mentality that we've been facing off the back of this. It's been fascinating to watch. The other issue about risk is communication. The one thing that I don't think we are still good enough to do as a profession is telling people about the problems that may happen. It's okay reacting to a problem, but actually are we good enough to go to the board and say, do you realize this is our exposure? Do you realize that in this scenario, that will be what will happen to our supply chain? And therefore, this is what we should do. And therefore, asking the question about the appetite to risk that your business has. And every organization has a different appetite to risk, doesn't it? Some will go, yeah, it's okay. We've got fluctuating, it's okay. Others, very much, whatever you do, avoid any issues associated with risk down through my supply chain. I remember being at a pharmaceutical company in Sweden, or Denmark, sorry. And we were running a supply chain conference. And we'd organized it all about cost, because that's what I was consulting at the time. That's what you got to do. And the chief exec walks into that supply chain conference, and his opening keynote was, we're making too much money, was his opening statement, okay? We're making more money than the analysts know. So don't worry about cost. What your job is to make sure that my production lines don't stop, to make sure that actually we have 2 sources for every part, to make sure that it actually is seamless. He said, that's your job. And then he walked off. Okay, and I'm stood there going, okay, so that's the whole 2 days of a conference destroyed because we were spending all our time on cost, but actually what he wanted was risk. And clearly the procurement people weren't talking effectively to the chief exec, both ways, to understand the challenges that they were facing and what they should be doing differently about it. So it's really important, I think, is to manage and communicate effectively about the risks that's there and to use the tools that we all have available to share the risks. Because again, that's what we're being asked to do. That is the biggest challenge that I think we have as a profession, is to manage, mitigate, and challenge those risks. And I think what Brexit has done for us is it's actually started to challenge some of those perceptions as we go through. It's also started to get people to really think about their supply chains. So, and localization, I saw it on a few slides earlier yesterday. Localization is becoming a big thing across the world, isn't it? Anywhere you go, every government wants to encourage the local manufacturing base and the local supply base. But in most cases, those suppliers aren't ready to effectively supply what you want them to do. We're not spending enough time developing that capability up. So we end up buying from the most reliable supplier that's around. So let's just take the UK and Europe as an example. So in the UK, people say, well, actually, I won't buy from Europe, I'll buy from the UK instead. But actually, there's only about 20% of the potential goods and services we get from Europe that we are capable of making in the UK at the moment. So we might get some localization, but not necessarily enough. The Europeans, well, they've got 27 other countries to choose from. So why would they buy from the UK? And we're already seeing sourcing decisions being made to move stuff out of the UK and into Europe, where it's availability, ease, political stability, currency's straight, so why would you bother buying from the UK? So we're already seeing people starting to make those sourcing decisions without knowing what the answer is in terms of the political situation. I'll come back to my point about supply chain tiers, the same challenges there. However, what it has done is it's made people sit back and say, do I have other options? If you look at your supply chains, I would argue that the majority of the people supplying you now were probably the same ones supplying you 10 years ago. We don't like change, really, do we? Stick to the tried and trusted, the companies that we work with. We know them, they know us, we know the operations people, the supply people, they understand our business. We don't often make that big change to an alternative supplier. But what I am seeing is people suddenly going out to the market now and taking a fresh look. Oh, I haven't really looked at that before. Oh, there's some innovation there. There's some new suppliers there. There's different locations. People are starting to look at their sourcing plans more effectively again. I think that's positive. I think that's a really positive outcome, that actually people taking a fresh look at whether or not their supply chains are set up in the right way. And maybe it's time to have some fresh new suppliers coming in and starting to freshen up what goes on through the supply chain. And I said, I think if you look at your supply chains, you probably find the same. You go to the market, you go on a tender, you all get very excited, and then the incumbent comes in very close to what they went with, all right, so we'll stay with them. Okay? We won't take the risk. Change is too tough. But maybe there's times where we should take that opportunity, and Brexit is giving us some of those opportunities to change some of those suppliers. But where you can't change a supplier, then it is about managing that supplier relationship. How do you work with your suppliers so they help you to manage the risk? Because it's not just on your shoulders, and it's not just on the supplier's shoulders. There's somehow between you, you've got to work out the best way of doing this. You know, what about the warehousing options? What about local manufacturing? Could they take something that's been produced in one country and make it locally for you or assemble it close to where you are? These are the sort of conversations that people need to have for relationship management, but don't necessarily have at the moment. So we are seeing now people focusing a lot more on supplier relationship management. We're still not doing it very well. Okay, I mean, if you ask anyone in this profession, how good are you managing your suppliers? Most of them would go, well, it's all right. Yeah, I've got a couple of good relationships, but actually there's a whole stream of suppliers I'm not even close to. Because we're very busy fixing some other things. We'll get to it next year. And I think we've got to really focus on the quality of those relationships with the suppliers, because that will help you to mitigate and manage the risk. Because that should be a shared discussion and not just a unique one for yourselves. So, Brexit is fun, it's challenging, it's giving us real issues around the supply chain, particularly around uncertainty. But hopefully, there's some lessons learned there that I've shared with you. We do have a survey that we're just releasing. I did hope to have it with me today, but literally it's been finished this week, that we ran just before the March deadline. And there's some insights there about what different sectors are doing in the face of Brexit, but also some of the lessons learned that I've shown up here are in there. So if you are interested, it should be on our website early next week, or contact any of us at SIPS, and we'll happily send you a copy of it if you're interested. If you're not, then don't worry about it. But if there's some lessons learned there, we're very happy to share them as we go through. Now, I have about 5 minutes, so very happy to open it up for any questions, any comments that people want to make about SIPS, about Brexit. I'll talk about cricket. I'll talk about the politics if you want. Talk about the Queen. Why not? Any questions for anybody? Yes, sir.
There was a couple of presentation on day one regarding Coca-Cola and the challenge they had in Ethiopia in being able to purchase their foreign exchange. How would you, as SIPS, try and assist the company?
We don't. I mean, you know, in terms of availability of currencies and availability of funds, I mean, the way that we assist is education. You know, and it's back to, are there specific things you can do around currency, hedging, mitigation, and risk that you can go and learn about? I think the thing about currency is at the end of the day, it is financial transactions. And there are experts that you need to pull in. I would never advocate a procurement person or supply chain can be an expert in currencies. I think you go to foreign currency advisors and get your financial people up to speed on what should be happening, because I think that's where the skill set sits. For me, we need to understand the implications of it, but I don't think it's a job for us to lead it, would be my view. You might not agree, but that's me. Any questions?
A statement and a question.
Sure.
Would you call Brexit a man-made black swan event? Would you call it that?
Well, just explain what you would describe as a black swan event.
Well, black swan event. We're in risk management. Black swan event is a catastrophic natural disaster.
Yeah.
You can't predict it. It's very unpredictable.
Yeah.
And then essentially like a fire and an explosion in a warehouse, we call that a man-made black swan event.
Right.
What would you categorize?
No, we did this to ourselves. Okay, this isn't a natural disaster. This is a political disaster. And I don't think you could call that sort of mandated black swan event. I don't see that that's what it is, because we can manage our way out of this. If the politicians actually get their act together and collaborate and talk to each other and sit around a table as big boys and girls and say, we need to sort this, they can sort it. They can go back to Europe, they can get an agreement, we can move on with our lives. So because it's political, I don't think you could cause it that.
Well, you answered my second question, and that is there an end to Brexit?
Yeah, it's a T at the end of the word. Yes, there has to be. We have to get out of this situation. Anyone in business, they're all saying to the politicians, please, please, please sort this out. They use stronger words than that. We need to get to a situation where we have a managed agreement to transition from where we are to a new relationship with the EU. The politicians are the ones who failed, particularly Theresa May, which is why she's gone.
Room for one more question? Great.
Let's say that Brexit goes through, and think about the future, not kind of the current struggles. But given Brexit happens, what would you like to see come from Brexit from the UK in terms of world trade?
That's a really good question, really good question. So let's take a couple of steps. We within business want to see a trading relationship with the EU that is still open and free flow of imports and exports for the EU. Because we are so reliant on the EU for the strength of our economy. People talk about the other countries. We could do a deal with China and do a deal with India and do the deal with, Trump's was in the States, was in the UK last week talking about what a great deal he'll do with us. Yeah, thanks. But that will only replace a small amount of the trade that will go on. However, we do see an opportunity to step out from the EU negotiated deals and do our own with some of those key trading partners. So I would say that there is an opportunity to have some more open free trade agreements with key economies around the world, as well as having their relationship with the EU. That's the best of all worlds. And if people like Trump, truth to his word, he does see the opportunity. He also sees the opportunity for his businesses to supply stuff directly into the UK rather than buying from Europe. So he's not stupid. Well, maybe he is. No, sorry. But we see an opportunity there for more open trading relationships with some key countries around the world that currently don't have those agreements with the EU. I am still I've been in procurement. I've been global sourcing. The more you can have those agreements, the more you can flow stuff in quickly, the better able you are to operate as a supply chain and procurement person. So clearly, I'm much more of a free trade type approach, and that's where I would love us to get to. It is going to take a long time because A, we've got to agree with the EU, and then B, we've got to unpick and start to put some of those other agreements in place. This will be a 10-year program by the time we get there.
Thanks a million.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much.